if you want to get something done, especially with a major supplier country like Australia, you're going to have to find a better way to do it than threats and attempt at intimidation.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia. The University of Sydney stands on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and future.
Hello, I'm Jared Mondschein, Director of Research at the U.S. Study Center, and I am personally very excited to welcome today's guest, Dan Rosen. Dan is a partner at Rhodium Group and a former White House National Economic Council and National Security Council staffer. He's also a visiting fellow with the U.S. Study Center this week, so it's great to get a chance to sit down with him and get a readout from one of the leading experts on the Chinese economy, both in the U.S. and globally. So, Dan, welcome to the show. Before I get to the many questions I have for you, I just want to mention that at the end of the episode, we're going to ask you to share your favorite fact, number, or statistic related to either the Chinese economy, U.S.-China trade, or the economic environment we find ourselves in. And if you're ready to go, let's get started. So, firstly, I thought maybe I could just get your take on sort of the current play of where the U.S., China, and Australia find themselves in economically. So, there's discussions of a new Cold War, economic decoupling, de-risking, deglobalization. What do you think is the best way to sort of think about the economic situation we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, thank you, Jared. It's great to join you for this. So, seen through an economist's eyes, I think the most salient thing to bear in mind about the U.S., China, and Australia as well, set of relationships here, is that we're in the post-pandemic phase of global economic activity. We had unusual patterns that described our trade and investment with one another that had everything to do with the way that big parts of the world economy were shut down, distorted, under pressure from the extraordinary forces at work in the pandemic. And now we're 6 months, 7 months past the end of the acute phase of that in China, once it went ahead and ripped the Band-Aid off and decided to just suffer through COVID without really properly vaccinating people. And so this is the moment where the test, where we see what the new normal is going to be in a post-pandemic environment. Is it going to look like things looked prior to the pandemic? Or is it going to be very different? And I would say that right now, almost in real time this week, we're starting to get the first definitive evidence of where things are headed.
Great. And so in terms of the state of play in this post-pandemic world, how do you think the U.S. and its allies, Australia in particular, are handling this post-pandemic world, and as well as sort of the broader strategic challenges that China has been posing?
Yeah, so I think what we have had so far this year is sort of the overture to the symphony, if you will. Folks have been in a waiting and a holding pattern, kind of hoping that the economic picture, when I say folks, I mean the Australian perspective, based on my sense of it. Folks have been working with the assumption that, until we see otherwise, let's assume that China's economy is going to come back to its pre-pandemic, supercharged role for us, which means some of the strongest growth in the world, especially important consumer of building materials, right? Which is a core part of Australia's endowment of resources, big part of the economic growth here. And hence the whole kind of Australian challenge of having the United States as the strongest security partner, but China as the strongest economic partner, right? Very particular position to be in is kind of predicated on Chinese growth as we've known it for the past couple of decades. And where we are right now in the economic conversation in the markets is that as of June 2023, the recovery of China's economy and the return to those sort of patterns of demand for what Australia is selling that we expected before the pandemic are faltering. And there are some lights that are blaring red right now, not even yellow, but red, that we need to put our seatbelts on. China's economy is going to have very, very stormy waters in the second half of the year. If that is the case, and if especially it's not just a temporary blip or hiccup, but instead kind of structural slowdown in the pace of Chinese growth, especially the property sector, which is where so much of that iron ore goes to, then it means we really are in a new era. And it's going to take some time to work out what the implications of that are for Australian exports, overall health and performance of some of the biggest companies in the country, and also the relative attraction of what's now happening in the U.S. economy relative to what's happening in the Chinese economy. It's not to say that China is not going to be a super important, really big economy out there, very important to Australia. But it is to say that a lot of the change at the margin, the growth that was expected to continue to pull more of the economic energy toward Beijing may in fact be overestimated. And we're talking about a somewhat different mix of opportunities for Australia going forward.
Could you maybe go a bit deeper on that? Do you think that China is ever going to return to anything close to what they had pre-pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's really the pre-pandemic. Well, yeah, you could say the pandemic or pre-pandemic especially, right? But look, I mean, 20 years ago, China was woefully underbuilt in terms of property, commercial property, residential property, for example. The past 2 decades have been a torrid pace of build out, really extraordinary. No limits on the amount of financing and debt that were available to property developers to get to work and do that. And that happened. And China has an absolutely massive property stock now. That is not going to happen again. There's not another need to build from scratch this just gigantic stock of residential and commercial property in China. There's still a lot of work to be done to upgrade property over time. There's always the stuff that was built 20, 30, 40 years ago where it's time to renovate, expand, build out, et cetera. So, there's going to continue to be a good, solid base load of property-related, infrastructure-related activity in China, but the property boom is not going to happen again. There are some things that haven't happened yet, which could still take place. For example, China is pretty seriously short on hospitals and schools throughout the rural side of the economy. And those will also need a lot of cement, plate glass, aluminum, steel, stuff like that, copper piping. So that's, a big unfinished business that still stands in front of us. And then China, like so many countries in the world, are going to have to divert a huge amount of their effort to climate adaptation. And consider in particular that the wealthiest, most productive, most impressive cities in China are all on the coast, are all in the floodplain of the coast. And there are tremendous sea level challenges that China faces as they deal with tidal surge and rising sea levels in the decades ahead. So, it's hard to even imagine the extent of seawalls that are going to have to be built, a lot of metal involved, a lot of concrete and stone involved to do necessary work to protect China as we know it from the climate stress that we have standing before us.
One thing that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is in terms of those Australian exports to China, why did China seemingly change tack with the Albanese government? What exactly is China doing with their sort of easing of those restrictions on Australian imports into China? And does Does China changing tact, or is this something where they just have a hard economic reality and they have no choice?
Yeah, well, so pretty much everything we do at Rhodium is economic analysis, where we can find the data to offer a strong statement or point of view. We do so, and we're very straight shooters about that. On the question of why and how the China's commercial diplomacy vis-a-vis Australia is evolving, I can't point to any particular data stream that will help me answer that, but I can offer you a few observations based on what I know that shed a little light on this question. The first is that whatever goals China has had in applying, shall we say, coercive measures, whether they're trade protections or bans on key exports and things like that, to market economies around the world, that hasn't changed the general tendency in the market economy world. The concerns that countries from North America to Europe to democratic market-oriented Asia have about the challenges presented by the way the Chinese system works, those concerns have just gotten more intense, more expressed, and there's more and more cooperation among market economies to talk about what's the right way to have a conversation with Beijing about legitimate concerns and interests that we have. So I guess whatever Beijing, would consider using a kind of strong arm toolbox to try to accomplish, I can't imagine how folks in Beijing feel as though, it was really working the way that they would like. And so it may be just, an acknowledgement that if you want to get something done, especially with a major supplier country like Australia, you're going to have to find a better way to do it than threats and attempts at intimidation, number one. Number two, whatever China's sense of its own leverage and strength in the sort of economic league tables was when coercive measures were first introduced a couple of years ago, its position is somewhat weaker now for the reasons we talked about before. I mean, there are really profound, basic macroeconomic challenges that China's now dealing with. And, all things being equal, it probably wants to consider de-escalating where it can on the external side so it can focus on its domestic problems. I can't say for sure that that's what the conversation sounds like in Beijing, but I would certainly be advising to, reduce tensions where I could if I were advising the Chinese leadership so I could focus on the homegrown economic problems that are becoming so very acute right now. But then finally, before we turn the page to the next question, Jared, I would point out that at present, this notion of China and Australia having a thaw is still, an assumption. It's not a done deal. Barley, wine tariffs have not been completely disassembled yet. There are a number of Australian citizens, I believe, that are still under extraordinary detention in China, which should be, reason for real concern about what the relationship is all about and how we behave with our partners out there, right? So, I hope that China and many other countries are able to find their way forward to a more constructive, pragmatic resolution of problems. Really, I would just encourage Australians to keep in mind that China needs friends out here in the world at least as much as you do. Don't forget that.
Great. Now, speaking of advising, you have you're not advising Beijing, but you do regularly advise lots of powerful folks around the world, and have just come off a whirlwind tour of Sydney and Canberra and other cities. And you also obviously know DC exceedingly well. So I'd love to know, as someone who has spent so much time, both personally and professionally, Australia and the US, what would you advise Canberra in terms of approaching this new reality, economic reality they're in, and how would that differ from what you would advise Washington?
That's a great question. Well, I will note that we get calls at Rhodium from the Ministry of Commerce staff with the Chinese government on a regular basis, and we're always happy to talk to them, always happy to share data. So while we don't have a formal advisory relationship for sure, we make ourselves available to anybody who wants to have a serious conversation about what's happening in the economy. And that certainly includes friends and officials in Beijing. Crucial part of the process and conversation for us. As for what I would have to offer Canberra, different from what I would have to offer Washington or Brussels or Berlin or someone else, the most important things that I had to share this week are really the same as I think governments elsewhere need to hear. There are sort of embedded assumptions about what's possible and what's not with China. Even very senior officials in the U.S. Have tended to discount the possibility that China's economy could slow down, for example. Certainly in Europe, that was deeply rooted working assumption right up until very recently. And across all these geographies, and certainly here in Australia as well, there now is kind of new open-mindedness and sense of necessity to catch up on whatever folks in the commodities markets, exchange rate markets, et cetera, seem to be getting panicky about right now. So the conversation is changing very quickly. Folks in government sectors kind of everywhere are checking to make sure their basic assumptions about the macroeconomic outlook are up to date and well-founded. And really that was my biggest objective in coming down here, to make sure that those observations, the analysis that backstops that, was offered and shared with folks here in Canberra. The one exception, well, not exception, but the distinct kind of observation for leaders and businesses and the general public here in Australia really is that if Australia was the sort of standout beneficiary of China's long super cycle of industrial and property and materials heavy growth for the past 2 or 3 decades, unfortunately, that necessarily means that it'll take kind of one of the heaviest hits to the economic outlook once China really does step down from, say, an assumption of 5 or 6% GDP growth down to something like maybe call it a 3%, maybe 4 at best in some years ahead, kind of GDP growth rate. Nobody's going to feel that really as much as Australia because nobody was benefiting as much from the growth in the past. That's something that I think folks here have long been aware of and have been happy to bear the burden of that problem. That because they benefit so much, therefore someday they're going to have the most to say goodbye to when the new era comes. However, there's a lot of good news for Australia too. Very strong cards to play. Unlike a number of many other advanced economies, even here in Asia, like South Korea and Japan, there is not a big Australian technology supply chain connection with China. And as you probably observed, the countries that have some of the most high-tech cross-border linkages to China are under the most pressure to sever those. And that's a separate and different kind of economic pain and discomfort, which Australia doesn't really have to worry too much about because that's just not the nature of the Australian economy. It's not really a high-tech play. It's this very much high-quality foodstuffs and materials play. Down the road, extraordinary opportunities to be part of the global renewable energy and clean energy economy of the future. So there's some good replacement options that were also worth talking to your colleagues and officialdom in Canberra. Yeah, those are some thoughts on what the conversations have been like here.
Awesome. Well, you talked about the importance of having their sort of view of the issues at hand backed by data. And one thing that I have to ask is personal perspectives. I came here over half a decade ago, and my first report was on the U.S.-Australian investment relationship and how there's more investment from the U.S. in Australia than any other nation, and Australia invests in the U.S. more than any other nation. Despite that, only 17% of Australians in our polling could correctly say that it was the U.S. who was the largest investor to Australia, and 71% thought that it was China who was the largest investor. Do you think it's a problem that Australians don't know who their largest investment partner is?
I think it can be a problem because not just here in Australia, but all around the world, really. And I would say, for example, in Sweden, France and Germany and Europe, and in Japan and South Korea and Southeast Asia, and even in the United States, there tends to be a kind of deeply ingrained assumption that China is a 10-foot tall player. Whereas the reality, as you just noted, is that they're really starting at a much lower base of involvement in the global economy, including here in Australia. And so in most industries and regards, they're not nearly as important force today as other incumbent economies such as the United States are. A lot of the popular perception of China is sort of an extrapolation of what people think China will be in 10 years. And, at the mark, while the U.S. may be the largest investor in Australia historically in terms of the stock of investment, at the margin in recent years, there's definitely been years where China was the biggest annual investor. And then if we look at some industries in particular, China's definitely overweight, in mineral sector investment, for example, among foreign majors participating here in some areas, right? And so kind of that brings us back to the top of our conversation again about whether the Chinese model, as we've known it, is going to be sustained into the future. Or, you could say, like Japan to some extent in the 1990s, the way China managed to grow so much, using so much debt, so much government influence over the system, necessarily means that they're going to sort of fall off the charts for a while and not reach that, super powered weight in our economic equations that the popular perception that you cite in your surveys suggests people kind of take for granted is an inevitability. In other words, to kind of boil it down to a bumper sticker, China's continued rise is far from inevitable. And the sometimes disappointing, sometimes bumpy participation with other market economies like the United States may not be as dramatic in recent years, but in the long run has a lot better track record for, remaining valuable and important to Australian interests, I would say.
Excellent. Where do you think China's economy will be in 5 years from now? Look into your crystal ball. Love to hear your thoughts on some predictions.
Yeah, let me answer it this way. I think in 5 years, I think the odds are China will either have acknowledged this year in 2023 that it has a huge amount of economic reform to do, and it will start a reform process that means extremely low growth and tough going for the next 2 years. But then by the time we get 5 years out, they're back on track. And we're talking again about a China that can get to its potential, which might be like a 4% growth rate when we're looking out at like 2028 or so, if that's what you're kind of asking about there. Alternatively, if all we see out of Beijing this year is more assurances that the party has this figured out and there will be a policy program that is going to prevent all these adjustments and more of this kind of state approach, then I think we might see, a little bit stronger growth for this year and next year. But beyond that, when we get 5 years out, we're really going to be talking about a China that's stuck in very low gear, 1%, 2%, 3% at the most.
Wow, that's quite a departure from what we're accustomed to. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, we want to talk about a fact, stat, or number that you think we should know. So can you tell me what you chose?
So favorite number game. Rhodium work done over the past year has shown that both for Europe and for the United States, about 80% of all the foreign direct investment we're respectively sending into China is being done by a mere 10 companies or fewer. So basically, only a few really big players are still up to the challenges of trying to put more resources to work in China. And that's a huge contrast with a few years ago when, literally hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of firms from Europe and the US were moving in, establishing a presence, looking forward to being part of the future growth in China. Now it's just a few giants that are still contemplating the challenge.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. It was such a pleasure to have you both in Australia as well as on this podcast. I was really looking forward to today's conversation, and you definitely did not disappoint. So thanks so much, Dan.
You're welcome. It's great to be with you.
As we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest. We have our Technology and Security podcast, TS, run by Dr. Mia Hammett-Harry, USSC's Director of Emerging Technology. We also have our USSC Live series that runs recordings from our major live events. Recent episodes have included our interview with former U.S. Ambassador to Australia, John Ferry, as well as our researcher responses to the AUKUS report and our panel discussion with the cast of Hamilton, Australia. You can find these on our website, ussc.edu.au, or wherever you get your podcast.